Hello everybody, here we are with another tutorial video on Think Like a Scientist, Act Like a Coach. I'm Coach Carmen Bott from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and today I'm going to talk to you very briefly about a phenomena that occurs during aerobic exercise called cardiovascular drift. And let's start with a little nerdy textbook definition, and then I'll get into some things that might make a little more sense. Essentially, cardiovascular drift are the changes in observed cardiovascular variables that occur during prolonged, heavy, submaximal exercise without a change in workload. What does that mean? Well, let's look first at cardiovascular variables. So when we hear this term, this is what what scientists are actually investigating when they're looking at this phenomena, cardiovascular drift. And they include heart rate, which you've probably heard of, stroke volume, which you may or may not have heard of, and blood pressure. Now, of those three variables, which one do you, as a coach, monitor as a means of tracking intensity during cardiovascular work? Right, heart rate. Okay, so heart rate is the key variable that we are going to be looking at today, but it's important to understand the trend in heart rate and how it relates to stroke volume. I'll mention blood pressure briefly, but you're not going to necessarily be putting a blood pressure cuff on an athlete when they're running around a track, so that's not going to necessarily be a key metric that we're going to be investigating. So first of all, before we get into this phenomenon, the next couple of slides on cardiovascular drift, we have to classify what the athlete's actually doing in terms of work. And as you can see here, I've got a picture of some of my athletes. These girls are wrestlers. They've just finished actually a pretty heavy aerobic training session. And that session lasted longer than 30 minutes. So that's how we classify long term. The second piece is this idea of moderate to heavy, submaximal. That is a classification that a lot of the literature uses in terms of intensity. And so instead of saying an exact heart rate range, they'll say either light, or they'll say moderate, or they'll say heavy, and they'll usually express it as a percentage of VO2 max. So moderate to heavy is considered 60 to 85% of an athlete's VO2 max. Now, how many of you know what your athlete's VO2 max is? Probably very few, and that's okay. I'm going to give you some heart rate ranges instead. So let's assume the athlete is doing aerobic work greater than 30 minutes with a heart rate between 75 and 90% of their age predicted maximum. That's 75 to 90%. So that's actually a pretty intense training session. It wouldn't be considered a light training session. And let's look at what happens. Okay, graphs. Now, graphs should not scare you. Okay, they used to scare me a lot in university. I thought, oh my gosh, what the heck am I looking at? But I'm going to quickly just talk you through it. And in fact, this is our last slide. And by the end of this slide, you're going to be an expert in this stuff anyways. It's not that hard. So in the top left, we have something called Q with a little dot above it. And essentially what that means is an expression of cardiac output. It's really how much blood is being pumped around the body per minute, expressed in liters during aerobic work. And what you notice is when athletes begin to exercise, so in the first roughly 5-7 minutes of exercise, you see this huge steep increase. So from around 5 liters a minute, a 4 times increase in cardiac output. And then because the pace doesn't change, and that's key, so we haven't changed the pace of the aerobic session, that cardiac output is now hits a plateau and it's maintained at 20 liters per minute for the duration of the work. And in this particular case, the athletes exercised for 60 minutes. So it's the 30-minute mark we're actually going to be highlighting today because there's some relevance there. But just keep in mind they did exercise for 60 in this particular sort of trend and collection of data. All right, let's look at B and C. Now, these are your variables that actually make up cardiac output. So stroke volume is one and heart rate's the other. Stroke volume multiplied by heart rate actually gets your cardiac output. So what you're going to notice here with stroke volume is that when we get to about 30 minutes, we actually start to see a decline in stroke volume. Now let's define what that is first. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that we pump out, per beat. And if we have a lot of blood returning to the heart during exercise, we call that end diastolic volume, or EDV. And ideally, we want large EDV scores, if you will. So lots of blood collecting in the heart, and then the heart will beat and squeezes all the blood out like a sponge, and whatever's left in the heart is actually called the ESV. Okay, that's the end systolic volume. So the initial increase in stroke volume here is actually showing that we've got good venous return, so good blood flowing back to the heart, increased contractility of the heart due to probably sympathetic nerve stimulation. A lot of the reasons why the heart rate actually goes up during exercise is from parasympathetic withdrawal. So we've got good nerve stimulation, and the EDV increases due to an increased return of that blood to the heart from the muscle pump. So the muscles are working, they're squeezing blood up, milking blood up towards the heart. The heart's nice and contractile, so they're the ESV, the amount of blood left in the heart, which is the other part of stroke volume, is minimal. So we can eject a lot of blood per beat. So you're seeing that here. You're seeing lots of blood coming out of the heart on each beat. And then all of a sudden, you see a decline. Okay, why is that going on? The stroke volume has this negative downward shift after about 30 minutes. And what they think is happening is that there's thermoregulatory stress now. So essentially we have a lot of blood not only now going to the tissues, it's also going to the skin, okay, in order to allow our bodies to cool itself down. When we're sweating a lot, we're actually losing plasma volume. So our blood volume, in essence, is actually decreasing slightly, and we have this redirection of blood flow to the skin so heat can be lost. So we start to see this decrease in stroke volume. Now, there's the physiology. You may or may not be interested in that. What is actually interesting is what heart rate does. And this is what you're probably zeroing in on as a coach. So if I look down here, I've got a picture of a polar heart rate monitor. You've got a heart rate monitor on your athlete. They're outside doing the work. All of a sudden, you want them in a certain zone, their heart rate's starting to drift. And if you look here, at about 30 minutes, the heart rate's around 150. By the time they get to 45 minutes, their heart rate's about 170. That's actually a fairly significant increase if you think about that as a coach. So we've got this initial increase in heart rate. The magnitude, of course, depends on the intensity of the work. And that initial increase in heart rate is because of parasympathetic withdrawal. And then as we continue on in exercising, we've got sympathetic nerve stimulation, and then we've got this increase in heart rate because of the decrease in stroke volume. Because if you look back to cardiac output, it's a straight line. Everything is sort of maintained status quo. So what is the take-home message here? If you are using heart rate to measure and monitor intensity during aerobic training sessions, and that's your only modality or metric you are using, you need to account for this particular phenomena. You will definitely need to account for it if it's hot outside. So I may take you back to that image of my athletes. This was last July, so it was very warm outside. You can also tell by looking at their frames. These are not your typical endurance athletes. They're extremely mesomorphic, very muscular. So we are going to be generating more heat than a slim cross-country runners. So keep these things in mind. What you might want to do when you're prescribing cardiovascular training sessions for your athletes is look at heart rate, but also look at pace. And if they cannot maintain a pace, then perhaps the workload's too high. But if they're able to maintain the pace, then and the heart rate's still drifting up, then we're okay. And you just want to make a note of that. So hopefully you understand a little bit more today about cardiovascular drift, and happy training and happy coaching. Thank you very much for your attention today.